And I'm Frank, and today we're admiring the second half of Chapter 37, the Eisenhower era, in Kennedy, Bailey, and Cohen's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, in English, we've been reading the book The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, and this takes place during the Vietnam War. Tell me more about the Vietnam War.
Alright, by the 1950s, the Marshall Plan and NATO had revived Western Europe for the most part. Originally, Vietnam leader Ho Chi Minh asked Woodrow Wilson to help him spread self-determination throughout Southeast Asia. However, with the Cold War, Ho Chi Minh began to grow increasingly communist while America grew anti-communist. Americans were providing aid to the French forces battling Ho Chi Minh. But America's policy of boldness was truly put to the test when a key French garrison was cornered in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Eisenhower decided to stay out of the battle, betraying the policy of boldness, so the Vietnamese nationalists prevailed in the end. After the battle, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, and Eisenhower promised aid to the pro-Western government of South Vietnam if a few reforms were enacted. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the Cold War in the Middle East?
You know I can. In 1955, America welcomed West Germany into NATO, which prompted the USSR to create the Warsaw Pact, an alliance similar to NATO, but for the East. In Iran, the CIA brought in the hated Mohammad Pahlavi, a Shah who seized power over the protests of the local people. More importantly, Gamal Nasser rose to power in Egypt and quickly moved to nationalize the Suez Canal, sparking the Suez Crisis, which was since the Suez Canal was principally owned by French and British forces. France and England therefore dispatched troops to oust Nasser and recapture the Suez Canal. But without the support of the US, they quickly withdrew. Unfortunately, the Middle East then created OPEC in 1960, or the Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Over the next 2 decades, this organization would undermine the US economy through restricting oil exports to the United States. Abe, I've noticed it's time for another American election. How did round 2 go for Eisenhower?
Pretty well. When the election of 1956 rolled around, Republican Ike once again faced off against Democratic Adlai Stevenson. Ike won the election, but he failed to establish a Republican majority in both the House and the Senate. Ike noticed that there was a lot of gangsterism and fraud in many American unions, so he passed the Landrum-Griffin Act, which tightened the watch on labor leaders for financial malfeasance and expanded the anti-union policies of the Taft-Hartley Act. When news arrived that the Soviets had successfully launched the satellite Sputnik, Americans began to doubt their scientific superiority. In a desperate effort, Ike established NASA, and there was also a strong move in schools to focus more on academics, to substitute square roots for square dancing. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the further developments in the Cold War?
Of course I can. As the Cold War dragged on, scientists realized that open-air testing of nuclear bombs would be incredibly harmful and cause mutations in later generations due to radiation and fallout. Therefore, it came as a relief to all when Soviet leader Khrushchev announced that the USSR was to halt testing in 1958. In fact, Khrushchev even called for a permanent disarmament of nukes, but unfortunately, Eisenhower ignored him. The Cold War cooled further as Ike and Khrushchev met at Camp David to discuss evacuation of troops from Germany. But such plans were halted after an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Russia. Alright, Abe. ¿Qué estaba ocurriendo en Cuba en este tiempo?
Well, good question, Frank. Latin American countries felt cheated as the US provided billions for European countries while only millions for Latin America. Fidel Castro mató el dictador Fulgencio Batista y se volvió Prime Minister de Cuba. For those of you that don't speak Spanish, a certain Fidel Castro overthrew dictator Fulgencio Batista and became the Prime Minister of Cuba. Castro began to denounce America and to confiscate American land in Cuba, especially after the Americans stopped importing Cuban sugar. Castro basically made Cuba a satellite state of the USSR. Many anti-Castro Cubans immigrated to the US, and America established an embargo that still remains in place today. Now, Frank, who became president after Ike?
Well, as the election of 1960 rolled around, the Republicans opted for Richard Nixon, while the Democrats chose John F. Kennedy. Nixon had proven himself a capable politician during the kitchen debates against Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, and Nixon was assisted by the fact that many Southerners would refuse to vote for Kennedy simply because he was Catholic. However, the people were behind Kennedy's New Frontier program, which called for poverty reduction and a space program, and his dynamic stage presence during the first televised debates carried him to victory over Nixon. What legacy did Eisenhower leave in regards to the United States?
Well, Eisenhower left the White House as a popular president, but he is remembered for seeming to almost control the legislative branch. Ike used his veto 169 times and was only overridden twice. Alaska and Hawaii became states in 1959, and they were both largely Democratic. The two states also made America focus more on East Asia and the Pacific. It is interesting to note that Eisenhower effectively ignored the issue of civil rights. He did, however, guide America away from war with the Soviets, and, though he was a Republican, Eisenhower reintroduced Democratic New Deal and Fair Deal reforms. Now, Frank, how would you characterize the literature in the age of Eisenhower?
No, time for another section in which Kennedy simply lists off names of authors. As we've both taken the AP test, we can personally assure you that you will not need to memorize this. But it could be helpful for the free response questions to know the highlights, so here we go. Famous fiction authors included Ernest Hemingway, Steinbeck, Kurt Vonnegut, and, most importantly, Joseph Heller in his masterpiece, Catch-22, my personal favorite book. Arthur Miller penned the famous play Death of a Salesman, while Tennessee Williams produced A Streetcar Named Desire and A Cat on a Haunted Roof. Another great novel was penned by J.D. Salinger in Catcher in the Rye, Abe's favorite book.
Muchas gracias por mirando. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
And comment down below if you have any questions. We'll catch you guys, as always, next time.